90% of the country couldn't read its own laws. A child was beaten for speaking her grandmother's language. And then, one man stood up, his name Traoré, his weapon a microphone, his target a colonial system no one dared to touch. But here's the question. If your voice had been silenced for 100 years, what would be the first word you'd say? This is not just about language. It's about power pain and the fire that starts when justice finally speaks. The Grand Hall of Ouagadougou had never been this quiet. Not during elections, not during peace summits, not even when the coup happened. Now in this moment, the silence felt sharp, like the air itself was holding its breath. The room was a masterpiece of contradictions: mahogany panels stolen from ancient forests, a chandelier gifted by a French president who no longer mattered, and microphones that hadn't been turned off since colonial times. Inside sat ambassadors in crisp suits, journalists gripping pens like weapons, and generals pretending not to sweat under their medals. Everyone had heard the rumors. He's going to say something dangerous. He might nationalize the banks. He's going to ask for more aid. No, he's going to attack France directly. But no one was ready for what was coming. Then came the sound of boots, not rushed, not heavy, deliberate. Captain Ibrahim Traoré walked in, not flanked by guards, not carrying folders, not even looking at the cameras. He wore a simple sand-colored military uniform, a red beret, no medals, no smile. What struck people most was what he wasn't carrying: no speech, no tablet, no script. He walked to the podium like a man who had carried something heavier than words his entire life. The murmurs stopped. The translators raised their headsets. The foreign dignitaries leaned forward. A child in the back, daughter of a minister, asked her mother, "Why is everyone scared of him?" He looked at no one. He looked at everyone. And then he said 5 words. No flourish, no build-up, just 5 words. French is no longer official. A second passed, then another, and then the room cracked. One reporter gasped loud. The French ambassador blinked 3 times as if waiting for a punchline. A microphone fell. Somewhere a glass shattered. The Minister of Foreign Affairs mouthed something in disbelief. The CEO of Téléphone Afrique gripped his phone, already texting someone. He did it. Shut it all down. The camera zoomed in, trying to catch Traoré's expression. But he didn't flinch. He didn't elaborate. He stood as if those 5 words were heavy enough to hold up the ceiling. One Western diplomat whispered, panicked, "Is this legal? He can't just do that." But he could, and he just did. Traoré took a slow breath, and this time his voice was like steel wrapped in cloth. For too long we've been asked to prove we are human by speaking someone else's language. For too long our children were punished for honoring the tongue of their ancestors. Today we stop apologizing for being born where we were and how we were. Today we reclaim what was always ours, our voice. The hall was no longer a room. It was a battlefield of silence. Some sat frozen. Some began typing. Some were already planning how to bury this moment under headlines: bureaucracy and diplomatic outrage. But they couldn't undo what they had heard. And far beyond the marble walls in dry villages with no internet, in classrooms without blackboards, and market stalls filled with laughter and code-switching mothers, something was already echoing. French is no longer official. It traveled like wind. Not shouted, but passed in hushed awe. Did you hear what he said? He said it in public, on the record. Back in the hall, Traoré stepped away from the podium. Still no notes, still no smile. Only now he looked at the journalists, straight at them. You'll call this madness, rebellion, regression. But one day your grandchildren will ask, why did a man have to risk his life just to speak in the language of his mother? He nodded once. Then he walked out. And for the first time in the Grand Hall's history, no one knew what language to speak next. The moment Traoré stepped away from the podium, the air snapped back like a rubber band stretched too far. For half a second, there was only the hum of live microphones and the frantic clicking of cameras. Then the French ambassador stood up fast, loud, deliberate. His chair scraped the floor like a scream. No prior notice, no consultation. This is unacceptable, he muttered, loud enough for the front row to hear, but quiet enough to pretend it wasn't meant for the room. He didn't wait for translation. He didn't wait for the president's gaze. He turned chin high and walked out, past the stunned guards, past the press pool, past his own translator who rushed to keep up. The cameras turned to follow him. That alone made headlines. Ambassador storms out of historic language declaration would be trending before Traoré reached the back exit of the hall. Inside, chaos bloomed in whispers. Cabinet ministers leaned into each other, hands over mouths, eyes darting toward the president as if trying to gauge, is this real? Is this suicide? One minister hissed, "We'll lose every grant by morning." Another snapped, "He didn't even inform finance. We have contracts, bilingual trade agreements, regional banks." "Let him finish it," someone whispered. "He's not done." They were wrong. Traoré had said all he needed to. The message wasn't in its length, it was in its finality. There would be no footnotes, no softening later in the press. It wasn't a proposal, it was a pronouncement. Outside phones buzzed like a plague of locusts. WhatsApp groups of donors, diplomats, and development firms exploded with disbelief. Is he serious? Do we suspend the infrastructure project? How do we even negotiate now? In which language he'll walk this back? He has to. Right. But inside the room, three people stood utterly still. Madame Aminata, DOP Minister of Culture, had seen more regimes fall than most of the men here had attended meetings. She didn't flinch. Her eyes, sharp behind bronze-rimmed glasses, never left the back of Traoré's head. Colonel Kabor Traoré's longtime ally and shadow stood like a statue. Not proud, not alarmed, just steady like a wall that knew it would soon be leaned on. And then there was Adisa. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't military. She was a linguist, a young one, at that brought in to advise on translation reform. But now as the room trembled with aftershocks, she realized she wasn't here to observe history. She was part of it. Across the aisle, journalists shouted overlapping questions. English, French, Arabic fingers, stabbing the air like accusations. Is Burkina Faso leaving the Francophone Union? Will schools shut down? What about legal systems, courts? Will there be language tests now for expats, for citizens? Is this a war on France? Traoré didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind him, Dop finally moved. She adjusted her head wrap, a striking pattern woven with the ancient Moor alphabet, and stepped forward facing the press. Her voice was quiet, but somehow it silenced the room more effectively than a gunshot. He didn't declare war, he declared memory. For once, we are choosing to remember who we were before they told us who we had to be. That line, too, would go viral. In the control room, one producer at a foreign news station turned to his editor and muttered, "We need subtitles for everything now." Elsewhere, a Western investor watching the live stream spat out his coffee and barked into his phone, "Sell the telecom shares. All of them. Tonight." Back in the hall, Adisa looked at Traoré. He hadn't moved. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't afraid. And for the first time, she wondered what happens when a leader doesn't just break the rules, but erases the language they were written in. She wasn't sure if she admired him or feared him, but she knew this history had shifted, and this room, this trembling, murmuring room, was too small to contain what had just been born. Outside the Grand Hall, the city of Ouagadougou stirred like a body waking up after decades in paralysis. At first, the streets pulsed with confusion. Vendors paused mid-transaction. Taxi drivers leaned out of their windows, radios crackling with bits of the speech replayed over and over by stunned broadcasters. Most of them didn't catch the whole thing, just the 5 words. French is no longer official. Some thought it was fake news. Others laughed nervously. A few muttered, "He's finally lost it." But not everyone doubted. In the bus terminals at the edge of the dry markets among the crowds who usually weren't asked their opinion, a strange sound began to rise, not protest, not panic, but something quieter, more ancient recognition. In the northern district of Cuba, an elderly man sat on a plastic stool under a neem tree and whispered a line from a funeral song and more. He hadn't spoken it outside his home in 20 years. His grandson standing beside him with earbuds still in looked up and asked, "Is that allowed now?" The old man didn't answer. He simply sang the next line louder this time. In the Western Hills, where children had been caned for mispronouncing French verbs, small groups gathered by school gates. Someone had painted over the school sign. The new one read, "École du Vent" in faded French. Underneath, in thick charcoal strokes, someone had written, "Kelly Wera," the School of Wind. By late afternoon, bits of celebration began flickering across the country, not parades or speeches, but quiet, stubborn acts of reappearance. Mothers telling bedtime stories in the forbidden tongue. Boys reciting proverbs their grandfathers taught them in secret. Girls writing names on notebooks in alphabets their teachers never taught. A language wasn't just a tool, it was a flag no one could burn. Inside the presidential palace, behind high walls and thicker silence, Traoré stood in front of a wide window overlooking the capital. He hadn't changed out of his uniform. He hadn't spoken since the announcement. The room smelled faintly of dust and dried ink papers, folders, binders full of laws written in French. Colonel Kabor entered quietly, gave a short nod, then left again. No orders were needed. Not yet. Behind him, a door creaked. Minister Tapsoba stepped inside, slow and heavy, like a man walking toward a train already leaving the station. His tie was crooked, his breath uneven. He didn't bow, didn't salute, just stood there for a moment, watching the man at the window. "You've doomed us," he whispered. The words fell between them like stones. Traoré didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was soft, not tired, resolved. "No, I've freed us." He finally turned, then slowly, calmly, and walked past Tapsoba without a glance. The minister remained still, eyes darting toward the window, as if trying to see what Traoré had seen. But he saw only the city, and yet beneath that city's buzz a spark had caught. Not a blaze, not yet. But something ancient had begun to breathe again. And no law, no threat, no foreign tongue could stop a fire born from memory. The cabinet chamber was built for grandeur, but this morning it felt like a courtroom. The long oval table gleamed too brightly under the overhead lights, as if hoping to reflect something stable. It didn't. Around it sat 15 of the most powerful people in Burkina Faso, ministers, advisors, party leaders, and not one of them looked sure of anything. At the head of the table, President Traoré sat, calm, fingers interlaced, saying nothing. It was Tapsoba who spoke first, as everyone expected he would. He didn't raise his voice, but the weight behind it was deliberate, rehearsed like a prosecution. "This move is reckless," he said, turning to no one and everyone. "We have no infrastructure to support a multilingual state, no legal framework, no curriculum, no trained translators. We've undone 40 years of diplomatic relations overnight." He paused, scanning the table, seeking nods. Some gave them quietly, others avoided his eyes. And for what, he continued. "Symbolism, pride. We're not an island, Mr. President. We can't feed people with pride. We can't run courts on emotion. We can't trade with the world and more." He turned sharply toward Traoré. "You've made a decision that affects 30 million people, without consulting any of us." There it was, the line no one had dared say aloud. "You did this alone." Traoré didn't flinch. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on a smudge on the table, as if measuring it against the weight of an entire country. The room waited for his reply. It didn't come. Instead, it was Madame Dop who spoke next. Her voice, as always, was smooth but strong, like a river cutting through stone. "My father was a farmer," she said. "He never went to school, never learned to write his name in French. But he built the first school in our village, paid the masons, carved the benches, planted the neem trees around it, all because he believed that a child should never be afraid to speak in front of a teacher." She looked straight at Tapsoba. French was the language of his silence. He was told that if he didn't speak it, he didn't think. That if he couldn't write it, he wasn't worthy of power. She leaned forward slightly. "He died believing that. And I'm still angry about that." The room shifted, uneasy, moved. Tapsoba exhaled heavily, turning his gaze away. But others looked at Dop, now really looked, not just as a minister, but as someone who had carried history in her blood. Across the table, Adisa sat with her hands in her lap. She hadn't spoken. She didn't want to. She had been in meetings before, academic ones, linguistic seminars, cultural roundtables. But this was different. This was raw power cracking and reshaping itself in real time. She watched the lines in Tapsoba's forehead, the tension in Dop's jaw, the stillness of the president. Every gesture was a paragraph. Every silence a sentence left hanging. And yet what paralyzed her wasn't fear of speaking, it was fear of being seen. She wasn't ready, not yet. But she listened. And as she listened, something inside her shifted. Not a dramatic revelation, Not a flash of inspiration, just a small grounding realization. This room was where the future would be written, not just with laws and votes, but with stories like Dop's, with silences like Traoré's. She didn't know what her role was yet, but she knew she had one. Tapsoba broke the quiet again, softer this time, like a man trying to offer a lifeline. There's still time to reconsider. We can issue a clarification, frame it as cultural emphasis rather than legal overhaul. We can say it was symbolic, that no practical change is coming. All eyes turned to Traoré. Finally, he looked up. He didn't smile. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said if it was only symbolic, the French ambassador wouldn't have walked out. And with that, the room knew. This wasn't a gesture. This wasn't a bluff. The line had been drawn, and every person in that room would have to decide which side they stood on. The envelope was unmarked, no stamp, no seal, just a plain cream-colored rectangle slipped between the pages of a policy report on rural school reform. Madame Dop found it on her desk that morning, nestled so neatly it might have been filed by an intern. She opened it absently, half reading the heading on the report until she saw the handwriting. Neat, sharp, foreign. Stop before it's too late. That was all. No signature, no context. Just those 6 words hanging like smoke. Dop didn't flinch, not at first. She folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket. Then she closed her office door, locked it, and sat down without removing her head wrap. Outside, the palace buzzed. Meetings, updates, briefings. The machine of government had to keep moving, even when the fuel was fear. But Dop knew the tone of that warning. It wasn't concern. It was command masked as advice. Threat hidden behind etiquette. She picked up her phone, scrolled to Kabor's number, and hesitated. Then she put the phone down. They were watching. Whoever wrote the note, they were close. Elsewhere in the palace, Colonel Kabor wasn't looking at envelopes. He was looking at metadata. The security logs had flagged anomalies, encrypted emails sent during the cabinet meeting, routed through obscure diplomatic servers in Europe. He traced the origin to a private device used in the northern wing. Not the presidential office, not culture, not defense. Foreign affairs. Kabor's jaw clenched. He cross-referenced login times movements and call histories. All signs pointed to one name, Tapsoba. The discovery didn't shock him. Tapsoba was too smooth, too rehearsed. The man had a hand in every negotiation, a contact in every embassy. He was the type who smiled during handshakes and tightened his grip during hugs. Kabor closed the file, copied it onto a secure drive, and walked toward the inner wing. He didn't alert security, not yet. This wasn't time for arrests, it was time for choices. Meanwhile, President Traoré stood alone in the courtyard garden behind the palace. The trees here were young, planted after the last regime fell. They hadn't had time to forget what the soil once knew. He leaned against a stone pillar, eyes closed. But his mind was wide open. The smell of chalk dust returned first, then the sound of wood slapping against wood. He was 9 years old again, sitting in the second row of a concrete classroom, speaking too fast, too fluently, and more. We Yerikin Midani. He hadn't even realized he'd slipped into his mother tongue. He was just excited, explaining a farming trick his uncle had taught him. The teacher had stopped him mid-sentence. Not with words, with a wooden ruler slammed onto the desk. We speak French here, she'd said coldly. If you want to be heard, be civilized. She'd written his name on the blackboard and drawn a red X beneath it. Then came the punishment, 3 hours kneeling outside, hands above his head, holding a book he couldn't yet read. And worse, the other children watched. Some laughed, some stayed silent, but none defended him. Even then, something cracked. Not in shame, but in clarity. Language was not a tool, it was a weapon, and he had just been disarmed. Back in the present, Traoré opened his eyes. Cabaret was standing nearby, silent as ever, but his eyes said enough. Traoré didn't ask how bad it was. He simply said, when Kabor handed him the drive. Yesterday, during the meeting. Traoré nodded, pocketed it, then said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he turned toward the palace and muttered almost to himself, the revolution wasn't the hard part. The betrayal will be. Behind him, the trees stood still, and somewhere inside, Dop reread the anonymous note, this time aloud, as if daring it to echo. Stop before it's too late. She folded it once more, but this time, instead of pocketing it, She threw it into the trash, unburned but unwelcome. The marble corridors of the United Nations felt colder than Adisa had expected. They shimmered with quiet power, polished shoes, polished speeches, and polished smiles that hid entire histories beneath them. She had been inside embassies before at academic summits and cross-cultural symposiums, but this was different. This was war, just written in suits sealed in protocol. She adjusted the folder in her hand. It contained her prepared speech approved by the Cultural Office, revised 3 times, and translated into both French and English for the convenience of the interpreters. But her hand didn't tremble because of what was on the paper. It trembled because of what wasn't. Outside the hall, screens flashed global headlines: Burkina Faso defies linguistic legacy. Traoré's war of words reaches New York. Will the UN recognize a non-colonial voice? Inside murmurs rippled through the chamber. Delegates whispered, many curious, some wary. Burkina Faso rarely made the front rows of global attention, and when it did, it was usually in the context of conflict or crisis. But today, all eyes were on the youngest woman in the room. Adisa approached the podium, slowly breathing through her nose like her grandmother once taught her. In through your nose, out through your name. She stood tall, tucked the written speech into the folder, and let the silence stretch. Just long enough to claim space. Then without warning, she spoke not in French, not in English, but in Moor. Ayira koninedun, ayenan funagoya. The interpreters paused. The room stilled. She repeated the line slower this time. Her tone was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Her eyes scanned the delegates, European, Asian, African, all caught between confusion and discomfort. Then she switched. Some of you do not understand the words I just spoke. That's fine. For a century, we've understood every word you've said, even the ones you never said aloud. Her voice didn't rise. She didn't need it to. Burkina Faso is not here to beg. We are not here to justify the sound of our mothers. We are not asking permission to be who we are. She stepped closer to the mic. Our dignity is not up for negotiation. There it was. The line that would be replayed on news channels, quoted in op-eds, shared in classrooms and protest placards. Some would call it arrogant. Others would call it dangerous. But most especially those whose own voices had been buried by empire would call it necessary. We come here speaking more, not to exclude, she continued, but to remind you that inclusion doesn't mean absorption, that peace does not mean silence, that recognition must go both ways. A handful of delegates nodded. Others took furious notes. Cameras zoomed in. Adisa closed her folder. She didn't read a single word from it. You may respond in whatever language you choose. But know this: Burkina Faso has already spoken. She stepped back. Not dramatically, not timidly, just firmly, like a door being shut with quiet certainty. As she returned to her seat, the hall remained silent for 2 heartbeats too long. Then applause, not thunderous, not unanimous, but genuine. And somewhere across the ocean, in classrooms where children had been punished for mispronouncing borrowed vowels, a new sound began to echo, the voice of defiance finally heard in its own language. The smoke could be seen from 3 districts away. Thick, black, unapologetic, it rose over Ouagadougou like a clenched fist. People stared from rooftops and bus stops, unsure whether to panic or pray. Fire trucks screamed through the streets, sirens barely louder than the crackle of ancient paper turning to ash. By the time Adisa arrived at the National Archive, the sun had already disappeared behind the haze. The air stung her eyes, but she didn't blink. The scent of burned parchment and melted wiring hit her like a memory she hadn't made yet. She pushed past a line of firefighters and guards, ignoring shouted warnings. Her ID badge dangled uselessly at her chest. This was not about clearance. This was about loss. She reached the courtyard, then stopped. What had once been the language restoration wing was now a blackened skeleton of beams and scorched walls. The sign above the door had cracked in half, one part still clinging to the frame, the other buried in soot. Her legs gave way before she knew it. She sank to the stone steps, unable to breathe. Everything was gone. Centuries of oral histories that had been recorded for the first time. Alphabet codices reconstructed by dying elders. The first official grammar of Moor written longhand by her own mentor. Bilingual teaching plans, children's books, dictionaries, phonetic archives. All of it ashes now. A young archivist approached, his face pale beneath a layer of soot. He knelt beside her, holding what looked like a warped flash drive. We found this in the server room, but The backups were inside too. Adisa took it in her shaking hand. We lost everything, she whispered. The archivist didn't reply. What was there to say behind them? Emergency lights flickered across the ruin. Power had been cut. Even the surrounding offices had gone dark, as if the building itself was mourning. Later that night, investigators confirmed what some already suspected. The sprinkler system had been disabled, not malfunctioned, but cleanly severed. The internal security footage from the past 48 hours was completely wiped. No backups, no cloud sync. Someone had known exactly what to destroy and how to do it. Sabotage. The word passed through government halls like poison through a bloodstream. In the president's war room, Kabor stood before the forensic team's report, jaw tight. Traoré didn't speak. He didn't need to. Someone inside the circle had lit that fire. In her apartment, Adisa sat at her kitchen table long after midnight, still in her smoke-stained clothes. The flash drive lay in front of her like a grave marker. She hadn't cried at the archive. She hadn't cried during the news briefings. But now in the silence of home, her body trembled. Not just for the loss, but for what it meant. Someone had declared war on memory, and they had done it in the dark. Not with speeches or debates, but with fire. She picked up her phone and opened the secure line to DOP. Her voice when it came was hoarse but steady. They didn't just burn paper. They tried to burn the future. DOP was quiet for a long time. Then we write it again. From scratch if we must, but louder this time. Adisa closed her eyes, her fist clenched around the drive. And in that moment, the devastation inside her sparked into something sharper. Not grief, but resolve. The smoke had settled, but the wound remained raw. 3 days after the fire, the National Archives still smelled like burnt ink. The outer wall bore a black scar, a permanent reminder that even memory could be attacked. Adisa stood alone at the edge of the courtyard, watching workers clear debris. Her eyes were dry now, but something inside her had turned rigid, not brittle, but forged. She held a clipboard, though there were no pages worth noting. Not anymore. Behind her, quiet footsteps approached. She didn't need to turn. President Traoré came to stand beside her, hands behind his back, gaze steady on the ruin. For a moment, neither spoke. Then softly he said, "Do you know what my grandmother told me before she died?" Adisa glanced sideways. She said, "They can burn your books, but they'll never find the story under your tongue." She let the silence stretch between them. "Then we lost decades." "No, Traoré," replied, his voice firm but kind. "We lost paper, not language, not memory, and certainly not purpose." She said nothing, but something in her chest tight since the fire unclenched slightly. He looked at her. "Our voices were born long before paper, Adisa, and they will outlive it." That night, in an emergency cabinet session broadcast live, Traoré announced the launch of Project Nambe Nambe, meaning to speak again and more. It would be unlike anything the country had attempted before. A nationwide oral history project, mobilizing students, elders, linguists, and volunteers in every province. Their mission to record, document, and preserve stories, proverbs, songs, and history spoken in indigenous tongues. No encryption, no bureaucracy, just recorders, voices, and memory. Within 24 hours, the Cultural Ministry received over 200 volunteer applications. By the end of the week, schools were turning classrooms into makeshift studios. Young interviewers sat cross-legged with grandmothers who hadn't told their stories in 50 years. Market vendors sang lullabies into phones. Farmers shared riddles once only whispered during planting season. For the first time in modern memory, the nation wasn't looking outward for its history, it was listening inward. And then came DOP. The Minister of Culture, ever composed, ever sharp, appeared on national radio one Thursday evening, just after sundown. Her voice, deep and measured, cut through static like a memory returning home. "Tonight I won't read policy. I will tell you the story of my father, a man who could not write his name, but who built the first school in our village with his bare hands." She paused. Across the country, radios fell silent. "He taught me that the future doesn't come from forgetting the past. It comes from honoring the parts they tried to make us hide." She ended with a proverb spoken softly and more. "If your name is missing from the book, write it in the wind." The phones at the station rang for 4 hours straight. Farmers called from fields. Women cried softly while holding babies. One retired soldier said he hadn't spoken his native dialect since the war, but now he wanted to teach it to his grandchildren. Within a month, Radio Nambe became the most listened to broadcast in the country. Dop returned every night at the same time, not as a minister, but as a storyteller. And soon others joined griots, poets, former street vendors, teachers, even prisoners. Each brought a voice, and each voice carried a memory. In a village with no electricity, someone rigged a car battery to a dusty radio just to listen. In the capital, a cafe projected the broadcasts on loudspeakers into the street, and people came not for coffee, but for the sound of their language filling the air again. Something had survived the fire after all. And as Adisa sat at her desk reviewing a fresh set of transcribed interviews, she smiled not because the battle was over, but because the voice of a people had chosen to rise from ash, not hide in it. The road curled like a sleeping snake through the hills of Tumbara, where signals faded and maps blurred. Adisa leaned against the window of the rattling Jeep, notebook on her lap, recorder in hand. The wind carried dust, but also something sweeter faint, echoes of music drifting from distant fields. She had left the capital days ago. No escort, no press, just a satchel full of batteries, blank tapes, and a mission to listen. The first village sat atop a sun-baked ridge, its houses built from red clay and thatch framed by baobab trees and terrace gardens. Children peeked from doorways, whispering to one another in a dialect so musical it felt closer to song than speech. An elder woman greeted her barefoot skin like folded parchment, a necklace of wooden beads swaying as she walked. "You've come to remember what we never forgot," she said simply. That night, Adisa sat on a mat beneath a sky spilling stars. The villagers gathered in a circle. Some brought gourds of millet beer, others brought memory. A grandmother began to hum. It was a lullaby, slow, soft, older than the borders that once forbade it. Her voice cracked, but no one minded. It wasn't about perfection. It was about presence. Adisa pressed record. Later, a boy no older than 10 stood up and recited a proverb with the clarity of a scholar. "The tree does not forget the sound of the rain, even in drought." The crowd clapped, not out of politeness but pride. By morning, she was in another village, and then another, Kawara Bini Kambolo, each with its own melody, its own rhythm of speech, its own way of shaping the air. She recorded fishers singing boat chants in languages banned from schools just a generation earlier. She copied riddles passed from fire to fire, voice to voice. She sat in one-room classrooms where children practiced new alphabets, sounding out symbols their parents had once been punished for speaking aloud. The letters were hand-painted on cracked chalkboards, MWDG in Mer script. "Say it louder," the teacher told them. "Make your tongue strong." And they did. In one village, a farmer showed her his songbook, not written, but memorized across generations. "Each crop has its own verse," he said. "If you plant without the song, the seeds sleep." Adisa smiled, recording it all. What she gathered could not be scanned or archived in files. These were living languages beating in time with the people who carried them. They didn't need permission to exist. They had simply waited patient, silent underground until someone came to listen. And now they were blooming. Not just in rural corners, but spreading. Young artists in the city were remixing field songs into music tracks. Radio Nambe aired dialect riddles at dusk. In the capital, a graffiti artist painted murals with Moor proverbs across concrete walls, one reading, "If your roots grow deep, the storm becomes your teacher." Adisa stood in the middle of a dusty crossroad, listening to children chant the alphabet in a dialect once left off the census. She didn't need statistics to know the truth. Language was no longer archived, it was alive, and it was walking home village by village. The document was delivered at dawn, thick with seals and bolded headings. It bore the weight of centuries, Constitution of Burkina Faso, formal petition for judicial review. Tapsoba's name was printed on the front page, alongside a list of co-signers, parliamentarians, retired justices, and one former ambassador. The language was sharp, clinical, and cold. The executive action declaring the removal of French as the official language constitutes a breach of constitutional protocol, legislative oversight, and international treaty obligations. The legal challenge had begun. By mid-morning, media across the continent were broadcasting the headline, "Burkina Faso faces constitutional crisis over language law." International outlets quickly followed. CNN called it a test of post-colonial identity versus state stability. Le Monde labeled it an act of cultural recklessness. Al Jazeera posed the question plainly: language or law, can a nation change its voice without breaking itself? In parliament, debates grew bitter. The opposition bloc, emboldened by Tapsoba's move, seized the moment. "This is not culture," one MP shouted on the floor. "This is chaos in ceremonial clothing." Another added, "You cannot build a modern republic on fairy tales and forgotten tongues." Protests began to stir in the capital, not massive, but loud. Civil servants worried about what language forms would use. University departments feared losing funding for international partnerships. French embassies quietly froze soft development grants. Behind closed doors, UN officials and Francophone Alliance members whispered terms like sanctions pressure campaign and economic alignment. The threat wasn't just legal, it was financial, and it was growing. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was different, not panicked, not complacent, but undeniably tense. Traoré sat at the center of the strategy room reading the lawsuit line by line. He made no notes. He didn't need to. He had expected this. Across from him, Kabor paced slowly, muttering. They waited for the movement to go viral. Now they want to cut its legs, Traoré nodded. They won't attack the culture directly. That would be too obvious. So they'll dress it in legal robes. He held up the document. But law is not neutral. It's written in someone's language, always. Meanwhile, Adisa returned from the field to find herself on the front page of multiple newspapers labeled everything from national heroine to cultural extremist. One headline read, UN speaker now face of a dangerous experiment. She laughed bitterly. In an interview, she was asked, "Isn't this all just poetic rebellion? Do you really think a country can run without French?" She didn't flinch. "No, I think a country cannot run on a language its people fear." At the Constitutional Court, cameras gathered like vultures. Inside, the judges sat in silence as the lawsuit was read aloud in French, the very act and ironic proof of its argument. Tapsoba, dressed immaculately, delivered a precise opening. "This is not about language. It is about law. We are a state, not a sentiment. Without procedure, there is no justice, and without justice, there is no nation." His voice echoed through the chamber. Even his critics had to admit he knew how to use a system's rules as a sword. But outside the courthouse, chants grew louder. A group of school children recited a Moor alphabet poem into a bullhorn. Nearby, a retired professor read ancient proverbs painted onto placards. One simply said, "If the bridge was built on lies, no weight can cross it." As legal arguments stacked inside marble walls, the streets were building their own case, not with evidence, but with memory. And in the weeks to come, the court would be forced to choose not only between two legal interpretations, but between two futures, one born in paper and the other in voice. The courtroom was colder than the hills she had just returned from. Wood-paneled walls, tight-lipped judges, marble silence. Adisa stood alone behind the speaker's podium. She didn't wear a suit like the lawyers. She wore a simple indigo dress, hand-woven, the kind her mother used to stitch under candlelight. The judge gave a nod. "You may begin." She didn't open a folder, didn't read notes. She simply began to speak softly at first. "My mother was born in a village called Bana. She lived there her whole life, paid taxes, voted, raised 5 children, buried her husband, fed the community when harvests were thin." A pause, but she never read a law. Now the room stirred, not because she was illiterate. She was brilliant. She could tell the weather by the scent of morning wind. She remembered 20 generations of names, but she never learned French, and that meant by the law's standards, she didn't exist completely. She placed a stack of documents on the table beside her. "These are land contracts, 52 of them, signed by farmers in 5 provinces. Every single one of these people thought they were agreeing to water rights, seed credits, or crop sharing." She flipped one open, highlighted text visible under the lights. Instead, they gave up permanent ownership of their land because they signed papers they couldn't read in a language they didn't speak, but one the law insists is universal. She turned slowly toward the judges. "What does justice mean if it arrives in a voice the people don't understand? Silence now." "Sharp. Whole." She continued stronger. "This lawsuit claims we are threatening the rule of law. But whose law, written by whom, enforced for whose benefit, She stepped closer to the microphone. We are not rejecting the world. We are refusing to disappear inside it. Behind her, even the court stenographer had stopped typing. She looked at Tapsoba. You say this is about legality, but for my people, law was never protection. It was exclusion written in ink. The ink of someone else's empire. Tapsoba looked away. Adisa drew a deep breath, and her tone softened. I'm not asking for French to be erased. I'm asking for our languages to be recognized. I'm asking that a mother should not have to beg her child to translate a hospital bill. That a farmer should not need a stranger to understand the paper that decides whether he feeds his family. She placed both hands on the podium, now grounded steady. When we speak of justice, we cannot ignore comprehension. And when we speak of comprehension, we must speak of language. One final pause. If a country only speaks through one tongue, and that tongue was never ours to begin with, then who does the country belong to? The words landed like stone in still water. She bowed her head slightly and stepped back. Behind her, a quiet murmur rippled through the crowd, not outrage, not applause, but understanding. One of the older judges leaned forward, frowning, not in doubt, but in reflection. And somewhere far beyond the marble walls and sealed windows, a woman in Bana sat by her radio holding a prayer bead, hearing her daughter's voice carry not only words but truth. The courtroom felt too small for the moment it was about to hold. Every seat was filled. Diplomats, journalists, elders in ceremonial cloth, young law students in pressed uniforms. Behind bulletproof glass cameras rolled in near silence. Phones had been confiscated at the door. No one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Adisa sat beside Dop in the front row, her hands resting quietly on her knees. She didn't glance at Tapsoba, seated directly across the aisle, surrounded by lawyers in dark gray. At the bench, the 7 judges entered. Their robes, deep crimson with gold trim, swayed with every step, their faces unreadable, their decision already made. The Chief Justice cleared his throat. This court recognizes the historical significance of the matter brought before it and the weight it carries for the present and future identity of our republic. A pause. Not a breath was wasted in the room. We have reviewed constitutional law, international agreements, civil impact statements, and the testimonies provided before this chamber. He lifted a thin folder. And we have reached our conclusion. Now the world seemed to narrow into a single moment, like a drum waiting for the first strike. The Chief Justice looked directly at President Traoré, seated in the reserved executive row. By unanimous decision, the Constitutional Court of Burkina Faso rules in favor of the executive order establishing the national languages of Burkina Faso as official, superseding French. A wave of air seemed to rush through the chamber. Not noise, not applause, but a collective exhale long held. The judge continued. Effective immediately, state institutions shall begin transitioning all legal, educational, and civic frameworks into recognized national languages. French shall no longer hold sole legal authority in the Republic. He closed the folder with finality. This is not the end of a language, but the rebirth of many. And with that, the court rose. No cheers, no music, just trembling hands. Quiet sobs, tight embraces, stares locked in awe. Adisa felt something warm press into her palm. It was Dop's hand, shaking gently. Across the aisle, Tapsoba remained seated. For the first time in weeks, his expression cracked, not in anger, but something closer to loss. Not of power, but of control. As the crowd began to rise, President Traoré stood slowly. He did not smile. He simply closed his eyes and whispered, "They heard us." And outside, under a widening sky, bells rang in the villages, not by order, but by instinct. Across Burkina Faso, the voice of a people had been judged and recognized. The verdict hadn't even cooled before the car engine started. Across Ouagadougou's wealthiest districts, security gates opened for the last time. Black SUVs loaded with luggage slid past marble villas. Bankers, diplomats, foreign consultants, the class that had long lived in both Burkina Faso and somewhere else were now choosing somewhere else. One law firm closed its doors within 24 hours. The partner issued a statement, "We no longer have the linguistic infrastructure to represent clients under the new legal framework." Several private schools halted enrollment. Elite French academies cited curricular instability. A well-known real estate firm transferred ownership to a European subsidiary for external management. To some, it felt like collapse, but to others, to many, it felt like clearing space. Because while the headlines screamed about departures and delays, something else was happening underground, or rather online. In a makeshift co-working space powered by a solar panel and sheer urgency, a team of 6 university students launched the first beta version of an app they called Nagoya. Its purpose was simple but revolutionary: translate legal documents from French into Moor and 2 other regional tongues in real time using a neural translation model trained on oral recordings and new syntax trees. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes land tenure turned into long-time dirt. But it worked. It worked. In the first week, it was downloaded 8,000 times. By the third week, it became mandatory for every municipal office outside the capital. Radio stations began running daily tutorials on how to use it. Elders who had never touched a smartphone were taught to speak legal terms into it and hear them echoed back in their language, not the colonizers. The Ministry of Justice, caught off guard, formally integrated the app into its transitional documentation protocol. One student interviewed on Radio Nambe said, "We didn't wait for permission. We waited too long for that already." At the same time, something ancient was waking up. In villages and towns, folk storytellers once reserved for weddings and funerals were being invited to local schools. Instead of textbooks, children read illustrated tales adapted from oral legends. Some had never seen their dialect written before. Now it danced across chalkboards. In the evenings, podcasts in Moor surged in popularity. Young voices retold ancestral myths, debated local politics, broke down international news, all in the sounds of their grandmothers. At first, streaming platforms ignored it. Then they noticed the numbers. One podcast, Wera and Sierra Roots and Roads, climbed into the country's top 5 most played within 6 weeks. It was hosted by 2 sisters from Bobodio Lasso, both under 25, who joked, argued, and broke taboos, all while using expressions the French dictionary never acknowledged. Even school books changed. A teacher in Koudougou rewrote her entire curriculum using proverbs as grammar lessons. A math workbook asked students to count goats in Moor instead of drawing French pastries. One child wrote in his essay, "I can finally speak at school like I do at home." And just like that, language stopped being a border. It became a bridge. While foreign investors issued cautious statements, local cooperatives bloomed. Farmers printed contracts in their dialects. Midwives recorded pregnancy guides in audio form for remote villages. A new kind of economy was taking shape, one based not on translation, but on recognition. In a press briefing, Adisa said, "This is not a rejection of the elite. It's a redefinition of value. For too long, intelligence sounded like someone else's accent. Now it can sound like your own." And in the president's office, Traoré watched a clip of 2 children reading a Moor storybook aloud to their grandmother, laughing, correcting each other, glowing with pride. He didn't say a word, but he knew. The exodus had made room for a return not of people but of voice. And it was rising from the roots, not the rooftops. They wore crisp white uniforms, designer sneakers, and frustration on their sleeves. A group of nearly 100 students stood in front of the Lycée de l'Avenir, one of the capital's most prestigious French-speaking high schools. Their signs, written mostly in French and English, read, "We want futures, not fairy tales." Languages don't feed families. Stop playing politics with our diplomas. Their chant echoed through the gated district, "No more dreams in dialects." Camera crews swarmed in. One girl, barely 17, stood on a ledge and addressed the crowd through a megaphone. "We've worked our whole lives to earn international scholarships. We're ready to compete with the world. And now we're told our language of learning is colonial, that our excellence is a problem." The crowd roared in approval. "We speak French because we want jobs. Not because we love Paris." She paused, then delivered the final line like a knife. "They're turning us into poets when we need to be engineers." The clip went viral by noon. Commentators jumped in. Some praised the students for their courage. Others called them privileged and tone-deaf. International news outlets framed the protest as a youth rebellion against linguistic populism. But far from the capital and the dusty plains of Ziniari, no one was chanting. They were solving equations. That same week, the National Mathematics Competition announced its winners, not a private school from Ouagadougou, but 3 rural schools from provinces where French had already been replaced by native languages. The winning team, 5 girls aged 13 to 16, had solved their final problems entirely in Moor. No one had expected them to place. let alone win. One of the judges, stunned, told the press, "It's not that they solve faster, it's that they thought differently." Their logic was grounded in metaphors and relational thinking unique to their linguistic worldview. When asked how they felt, the team leader simply said, "It felt like solving puzzles in my grandmother's voice." The media, starved for contrast, ran both stories side by side. Protests in the city, victory in the dust. And then came Adisa. She didn't hold a press conference. She posted a single message on her verified account. "We're not training competitors. We're raising citizens." It was retweeted 200,000 times in 2 days. Some students from the protest responded angrily. Others quietly unfollowed. But a different group from inside their own ranks began to question. One anonymous post from a lycée student read, "Maybe our fear isn't about the language. Maybe it's that we're no longer at the center of the future." Meanwhile, in Bobo Dioulasso, a young poet who once recorded verses in a tin-roof radio booth, now had his first collection printed in 3 native tongues. His book, We Begin in the Mouth, sold out in a week. He had once failed French literature twice. Now his poem opened the new national literature textbook. The final stanza read, "Let the tongue twist around the name they couldn't spell and build a nation from syllables no one could burn." The government building smelled of new ink and fresh wood, the scent of transformation in paperwork form. Inside the Ministry of Justice, rows of clerks hunched over computers and reams of paper. But this time it wasn't in French. It was in Moor, and Dioula, and Fulfulde. The pilot had ended. The verdict had been passed. Now began the real work implementation. Across Burkina Faso, new signs appeared in courtrooms and city halls. Civil codes were no longer monolithic. Every major law, from land rights to marriage statutes to traffic regulation, was now printed in multiple national languages, each version verified and sealed. For the first time in the country's legal history, a farmer from Gourma could read the document that governed his land. A teacher in Dano could explain voting rights to her students without translating in her head. A police officer in Toma could issue citations in the same language the driver used to explain himself. It wasn't easy. Translating legal language required nuance. Words like jurisdiction or consent didn't always exist in literal form, but new words were coined. Ancient proverbs were referenced. Linguists worked side by side with jurists, and local elders became sudden consultants on civic structure. The result, a body of law that no longer stood above the people but among them. At the Ministry of Education, textbook distribution ramped up. Entire syllabi, history, biology, mathematics had been rewritten in Moor and Dioula. Classrooms echoed not with borrowed phrases, but with familiar syllables. Children no longer hesitated when reading aloud. They spoke the language they dreamed in. At a small village school, a boy was asked why he liked his new history book. "Because the people inside it sound like my uncles." Meanwhile, government broadcasts shifted tone. President Traoré's weekly address, once a polished affair, read in French, now began in Moor, with subtitles in French reversing the traditional hierarchy. His first sentence after the change became a national quote. "This time the law will speak like the people." Across ministries, public servants began taking fluency exams in at least one national language. Interpreters were hired not to bridge upward, but to bridge outward, reaching the parts of the nation long spoken over. Even international embassies began to adapt. The EU delegation requested certified translations of diplomatic agreements. The UN offered language learning grants to its local staff. Change wasn't immediate, but it was permanent, and it wasn't a revolution of volume, not loud, not angry. It was quiet, steady, and deliberate, like a language returning home, like a law finally listening. He arrived with no entourage. No cameras followed, no aides, no speeches. Just a dusty sedan parked outside a schoolyard where children's laughter outshone the rusted swings. Tapsoba stepped out slowly, adjusting the collar of his now plain cotton shirt. He looked older not because of time, but because time had finally slowed down enough for him to be present. This was the village where he had been born, Zignare in the northern province, a place he hadn't visited in nearly 20 years, not since the last of his relatives had passed. At the gate of the small school, a teacher raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She simply opened the latch and gestured toward a single-story building with a hand-painted sign above the door, Kofi Gunga, the House of First Words. Inside the walls were covered in posters, written entirely in Moor alphabets, animal names, rhyming verses shaped like stars and leaves. The voices of children repeated after their teacher in sing-song melody ba. Bo, boo, nam, no, no. He stood there for a long moment watching. Then wordlessly, he took off his shoes, walked to the back of the classroom, and lowered himself onto the tiny wooden bench next to a row of 5-year-olds. Some giggled. One little girl poked his sleeve. The teacher didn't introduce him. She didn't need to. She simply handed him a chalkboard slate and pointed to the day's lesson. Write the letter for water. Tafsoba stared at the curves and dots. He had once rewritten entire constitutions in French. Now he could barely mimic a single glyph. His hand trembled as he drew the symbol. It came out crooked, reversed. The boy next to him leaned over and whispered, "That's okay. It takes time." The irony was thick, almost cruel. Tafsoba had stood before international courts defending French as the only language of law, had declared Moor a backward relic on national television, had insisted repeatedly that progress only came in the tongue of the powerful. But here now his power meant nothing. Because the teacher spoke only in Moor, the lesson continued, shape sounds a song about rain and millet. Tafsoba mouthed the words quietly, stumbling. The vowels felt foreign in his mouth, but he stayed. After an hour, the children went outside for water and fruit. He remained staring at the board, rewriting the same syllable over and over. The teacher walked by, glanced at his page, and gently corrected his stroke. "Not goo," she said, smiling. "Try again, like you're scooping the sky." He tried again. It was still messy, but it was his. He didn't come for headlines. He didn't ask for forgiveness. There were no apologies, no redemption speech. Only a man stripped of titles sitting among 5-year-olds learning the language he had once tried to silence and finally hearing it for the first time. Outside, the children began to sing the alphabet in Moor. Inside, Tafsoba stayed at the back of the room, and for the first time he didn't feel superior. He felt home. The letter arrived folded in thick cream paper, hand-delivered by a quiet man in a neutral-colored uniform. No entourage, no emblem. Just a seal pressed in wax and a line of script on the front in neat handwriting. To Mr. Tafsoba, Zinjare Primary. No 3. Tafsoba opened it after the children had gone home, while the sun slipped behind the ridge, and the classroom walls glowed in the colors of soft charcoal. He unfolded it slowly, unsure if he was ready. Inside was a single sheet unadorned, bearing only the crest of the presidency at the top, and a short message written entirely in Moor. He read it once aloud, then again in silence. "You were wrong, but you are not alone. Even traitors can return if they come speaking the truth. Traoré." There was no demand, no offer, no position. Just a sentence that weighed more than any verdict he'd ever delivered. He folded it carefully and placed it inside the back cover of the Moor alphabet primer he now carried everywhere, dog-eared and underlined, smudged with chalk and oil from the children's hands. The next morning he arrived at school before sunrise. He swept the dust from the courtyard, drew fresh water from the well, straightened every bench, fixed a loose hinge on the blackboard. When the teacher arrived, she blinked in surprise. "You're early," she said. Tafsoba smiled. "I'd like to help," he replied. She tilted her head. "To teach," he shook his head gently. "No, not to teach, to learn." From that day forward, he became a fixture at the school, not as a politician, not even as a mentor, but as the oldest student in the room. Children took turns quizzing him. One girl insisted on calling him Tonton Tapo. He laughed the first time, then cried when no one was looking. He sat cross-legged beside a boy who couldn't yet hold a pencil and whispered syllables slowly with him. He stayed after school to recite proverbs with the janitor. On weekends, he helped paint murals of birds and village maps on the courtyard wall, labeling each in Moor, careful with every stroke. He said little, listened more. One day when the local education inspector came by, she paused outside the window and watched Tafsoba gently correct a 6-year-old's spelling without embarrassment or authority, just care. Later she asked, "You once spoke in Geneva. Now you repeat sounds with toddlers. Why stay?" Tafsoba smiled without looking up. "I'm doing something I never did in Geneva. I'm understanding." That night he unfolded the note from Traoré again, not to read it, but simply to hold it. And in that quiet moment, under a sky blooming with stars and crickets, a former architect of exclusion was learning to build again. Not with policy, but with presence. Not with argument, but with language. The courtyard of the school shimmered with heat even in the early hours. Children's shadows darted like birds beneath the neem trees, laughter ringing against the clay walls. Tapsoba stood at the edge of the yard, chalk in one hand, a worn Moor alphabet book in the other. He no longer felt the eyes of the village on him, not in judgment, not in suspicion, just in observation, as if waiting to see whether he'd return again tomorrow. And he would. He always did. That afternoon, a quiet figure approached, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a simple linen tunic instead of a uniform. There were no cameras, no motorcade, no announcement. It was Traoré. The children whispered in excitement, but the teacher raised a finger, and silence returned like a wave. Tapsoba met him under the shade of the lone fig tree. They didn't shake hands. Didn't need to. Silence was enough. Traoré glanced at the book in Tapsoba's hand. "You've turned a page," he said, nodding at the smudged cover. Tapsoba gave a faint smile. "It's harder than I thought." "The children correct me," good Traoré replied. "They're the future. Let them lead." There was a long pause. Then, without turning, Traoré spoke again. "The revolution doesn't need enemies. It needs witnesses." Tapsoba's fingers closed around the spine of the book. The words settled over him not as forgiveness, but as invitation, a chance to remain, not as a voice, but as an ear, not as a sculptor of law, but as a student of consequence. "I thought I had to be right to matter," Tapsoba said. Traoré finally looked at him. "You only had to listen." And then he was gone, walking back down the narrow path between the mango trees where the dust rose gently behind his steps, not as a trail of command, but as the quiet echo of something complete. That evening, Tapsoba returned to class. He sat cross-legged on the floor with a group of children forming syllables in soft unison. The teacher let him lead the last line of the chant. He stumbled once. A little boy laughed, then whispered the correct sound in his ear. Tapsoba nodded, repeated it slowly, and this time said it right. No applause followed, just the rustle of notebooks closing and the call of mothers from beyond the courtyard walls. But something had shifted. He was no longer trying to fix the country. He was becoming part of it again, not as architect, not as traitor, but as witness. And perhaps in that witnessing, something sacred was being restored, not in marble halls or press releases, but in voices small enough to hear only when one truly listens. The hall was modest, but the air inside carried the weight of 1,000 names. The first graduating class of the National Law School under the new language policy sat in rows beneath a ceiling draped in local cloth. Their black robes were stitched with gold thread, spelling out their names in Moor, Fufu, Dudula, and Mosi. There was no translation provided for foreign dignitaries this time. The invitation had been clear. This ceremony will be held in the voices of the land. Adisa stood near the back, arms crossed over her chest, quiet pride in her eyes. She didn't speak, just watched as dozens of students rose one by one, their names called not in French, but in the tones of their grandmothers. Kavde na Amadou, Sira Kambu, Yeninga Tapsoba. The crowd responded not with cheers, but with claps in rhythm, a tradition drawn from village celebrations, where joy is spoken with palms and feet, not microphones. And then came the valedictorian, a tall, soft-spoken woman from the Sahel region. Her gown billowed slightly as she stepped up to the podium. She looked out at the room and began her speech. First in Moor, then in Fulfulde, then in Dioula, then in Bissa, finally in Mosi. Each transition was smooth, intentional. The cadence shifted, the vowels danced, but the message remained the same. We are no longer echoes. We are the origin of our own meaning, and the law, like the land, must begin in the language of those who keep it alive. The room stood in silence when she finished, not because they were stunned, but because no applause could match what had just been spoken. Adisa wiped a tear, just one, before slipping quietly out the side door. The next revolution would not be televised. It would be spoken. He walked into the classroom with the same boots he wore the day he took the podium in Ouagadougou, but now they were dusty from travel, scuffed from time. No cameras followed him into the rural school where he once sat as a stubborn boy. Just a folded paper in his pocket and a box of books under his arm. The children stood as he entered. The teacher, startled, motioned for them to sit. She had not been told he was coming. Traoré smiled. "I'm not here to speak to the world," he said. "I came for this room." He opened the box, pulling out old notebooks, maps, and a faded report card from decades ago. He held it up, tapping one section where the ink had bled through slightly. "Refused to speak French. Difficult to discipline." The children giggled. Traoré grinned with them. "Back then," he said, "they called our silence defiance. But sometimes silence means your voice hasn't found room yet." He knelt down beside a small boy, handed him the report card. "Can you read this word?" he asked, pointing to the line in French. The boy shook his head. "No, sir." Traoré turned the paper over. On the back, someone, perhaps a young Traoré himself, had scrawled a single word in Moor. The boy's eyes lit up. "That says Saya. It means truth." Traoré smiled, standing up. "Correct." He turned to the class, voice soft but sure. "Your tongue is your inheritance. It carries your history, your humor, your power. Use it. Protect it. Never apologize for it." The children repeated his final sentence aloud, once in Moor, once in Dula, once in Fulfulde, and then the bell rang. As the children scattered into the sun, their laughter rising into the air, Traoré stood still, watching them, like one watches a fire that now burns without help. His revolution was no longer his to carry. It was theirs. There were no more headlines. Just the quiet hum of radios in kitchens and fields, telling the news in voices that sounded like home. In a courtroom in Kaya, judges debated new environmental regulations, in Moor citing local metaphors in their legal interpretations. In a rural province, a farmer leaned against his cart, reading a newly printed tax code aloud to his neighbor. No interpreter, no guessing, no fear. In a school in Bobo Dioulasso, children recited multiplication tables in Fulfulde, counting rhythm with their feet, singing it like an ancestral song. Across the country, the voices of elders were being recorded and archived, not as artifacts, but as reference texts. Local podcasters debated election reform. Storytellers were hired by schools. New songs blended old dialects with hip-hop beats. And in a tiny village surrounded by windswept millet fields, a little girl sat beside her grandmother. A book rested on her lap, pages bound in thick textured paper. The cover had a symbol drawn from ancient stone carvings, the title written in Moor. The girl cleared her throat. "Beng Nasi," she began slowly. The grandmother closed her eyes, listening. Outside, the wind caught their words and carried them past the trees, over the hills, toward other homes, other readers, other voices waiting to return. No fanfare, no grand closing. Just two generations speaking to each other again. The revolution was no longer on paper. It breathed. This story is more than a political drama. It's a quiet revolution, one that reminds us that real power doesn't always arrive with guns or flags, but in something far more intimate: the words we whisper to our children, the names we call ourselves, and the language in which we tell our truths. What struck me most wasn't just Traoré's bold announcement or the courtroom battles that followed, but the quiet transformation of hearts, especially in characters like Tupsoba. His return to a classroom, not as a teacher but as a learner, is a powerful metaphor for humility, for change, and for the long road toward healing. There's a beauty in watching a nation reclaim its voice, not to erase others, but to finally hear itself. The students, poets, farmers, and children didn't need a perfect system. They needed permission to belong in their own words to their own future. It's easy to overlook how much language shapes identity. For decades, many were taught that success required silence, that to be heard globally, they must first forget how to speak locally. This story breaks that illusion. It says dignity doesn't require translation. Most of all, it left me wondering how many stories, ideas, and dreams have we lost simply because they were spoken in a voice we weren't listening for. This isn't just a story about Burkina Faso. It's about all of us. Wherever you're from, whatever language you first cried in as a baby, that language matters. And maybe the future is not just built in labs and capitals, but in village schools, late-night radio stations, and in lullabies passed down by memory. So I ask you, what part of your voice, your story, have you been told to hide? And what would happen if, just like them, you dared to speak it out loud? If this story touched, you don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.